Lincoln's Inn forums for 2020. Last year we focused on women, and this year we focus on race. And in February, Lord Justice Singh chaired a panel looking at the lack of diversity in the senior judiciary and how that might be redressed. And tonight, the title of the forum is Bar, BAME and COVID-19. BAME could be transposed with people of colour or the global ethnic majority, for example. Some people support the grouping or labelling as something positive, and others have an issue with it. And it led me to start thinking about, what are we really talking about tonight? What are we trying to achieve? And I think that can be summarised in two words: race equality. And to do that, we need to understand that different people with different ethnic backgrounds experience racism in different ways. And we have to accept that the system of power that has been created has led to and enabled institutional racism to thrive. So my hope tonight is that we can have a frank and open discussion, and to look at what we can do as individuals and as a group to effect change, not just in the profession or even in the legal system, but for society. So with those words, I will hand over to Brie and Neil. Thank you.
Good evening all. I'm Brie Stevens-Hoare and I'm co-chairing this evening with Neil Chawla, who I hope you can also see on your screen. I get to do the housekeeping stuff. So first of all, the format of this evening, Neil and I will be asking the panel a few questions. That will be for about 50-55 minutes. We're then going to put questions from the audience. We've had a couple of questions in advance, and in addition to that, you can put questions to our panel using the Q&A function that you'll find on your screens. If you want to direct the question to a particular panelist, then indicate that by inserting their name. And if you want to remain anonymous, then if you just put anon at the beginning of your question, Neil and I will know not to indicate your name. We will then ask the panel questions as they've come through. We will do our best, if there are lots of questions from the audience, which we hope there are, to make them representative of the points that you're raising. Can I ask everyone to stay on mute? I'm not sure you actually have the ability to come off mute, but if you do, please don't while the panel are talking in the course of the event, because we want to hear everything they have to say. This event is being recorded, and the intention is to put it on the Lincoln's Inn YouTube channel in due course. If I can then hand over to Neil to introduce our speakers tonight.
Yes, and before I do, can I emphasise this is an interactive conversation. If we don't have this conversation, it's giving racism a pass and making it invisible. So please, please ask away. It's important that everyone gets involved in this difficult conversation. And let's face it, it's a fantastic opportunity to have your questions considered by such a distinguished panel. And we are fortunate to have three eminent speakers. For those who have obviously sort of logged on for the event, they've no doubt clicked on their profiles, and I'm not sure I can necessarily do their profiles justice. So I think I'm going to just summarise and taking them in order that they appear on my screen. Firstly, we have Natasha Shotunde, a barrister at Garden Court Chambers. and she specialises in family law. One of her passions is social mobility, and I understand she's the co-founder and chair of the Black Barristers Network. So Natasha, just tell me, how did that come about and what does it involve?
The Black Barristers Network, the idea came about because I felt incredibly lonely at the bar. And at an event that I was volunteering at, I met my co-founder, Mavis Amono Akwa, and we spoke about setting up a network of Black barristers, and that started. In terms of our mission, we have been working towards increasing the visibility of Black barristers, providing support to Black barristers, and working on community outreach.
Brilliant, fantastic. That sounds like a fantastic initiative, Natasha. Next on my list, on my screen, we've got Joe Sidhu QC, a criminal silk working from 25 Bedford Row and also number 5. As well as his practice, he regularly appears on TV and radio, speaking about legal and political issues. And in fact, speaking about TV, he recently appeared on, I understand, the Seek channel on the 27th of May, speaking about COVID and the scepticism of the public, of the experts who seem to be working from a script in favour of the government and the need for trust. And Joe, what do you think now that the briefings have stopped, even though we're still in the dangers of the pandemic, and as we can see in Leicester?
Very true, Neil. I mean, now that the briefings have stopped, I think we should start digging up the bodies of the scientists who have been hidden away somewhere. I mean, obviously the government were very keen to have a scientific cover when policy on dealing with the COVID crisis was becoming more and more intense and difficult to manage. And now that it seems, at least from the government's perspective, that we've gone over the brow of the hill and we seem to be making progress, the scientists have disappeared. I think it's a very interesting factor that we should think about when we consider race as well, that we have experts in the field, and the experts are very important, but sometimes experts become human shields for politicians who need to get some sort of legitimacy or justification, which is why I think this evening is so important for us, because we've got not just the 3 of us who are panelists, but others as well, who can offer a great deal of insight and expertise into the issues that we're considering tonight.
No, I totally agree, Joe. For those who haven't seen that sort of programme, I'll make sure it's posted on the chat for people to look at it. Last, but by no means least, we have Professor Leslie Thomas QC, a silk at Garden Court Chambers, and as well as his public law practice, he lectures widely and has recently taken over the reins from Professor Joe Delahunter QC, and in doing so has become the first Black Professor of Law at Gresham College. Leslie, how does that make you feel, and what does that involve?
Well, Gresham's been in existence for 400 years, and I feel quite proud of the fact that they've chosen me to be their next Professor of Law. I'm going to be using the platform to bring to the general public's attention some of the issues that are, relatively current at the moment. Death at the hands of the state. I couldn't have planned the timing, given what's been happening in America and what's been happening in the UK with the Black Lives Matter movement, the tragic and unfortunate, horrific murder of George Floyd. These are all issues that my lecture series will be touching upon. And the other thing that I like about Gresham is that they believe in free education for all. So the very fact that you have this institution where anybody can access it as long as you've got access to the internet, I just think that's a fantastic idea and opportunity for people to educate themselves on something what they may not be familiar with.
No, absolutely, Leslie. And in fact, if this topic itself is very important to him, as If anyone's read the July edition of Counsel magazine, they'll have no doubt read his article about racial diversity at the bar and how it matters. And in fact, I also encourage people to read that. So thank you, Leslie. So that's the panel that we have. As I say, don't forget to send in your questions, and they'll hopefully be looked through. We won't get time to go through all of them, I'm sure, but we'll try. And without further ado, let's start the conversation, Brie.
Indeed. So questions on the Q&A. Leslie, voice lovely and silky smooth, but apparently some participants couldn't hear you. So if you can turn up your mic, that would be great. So first of all, and I'm going to put this question to all of you, but you first, Joe. Is there a particular event or a particular aspect of your professional life which highlighted for you the existence of institutional and systemic racism within the legal profession?
It's a really interesting question, Brie, and I'm going to be a bit greedy and choose two examples, one from my personal life before I became a barrister, and the other from a time when I was in my junior years at the bar. And I think it's difficult for me, at least as an individual, to separate the two in my mind, because the first example from way before I ever decided that I might like to be a barrister undoubtedly informed my thinking about the way in which the criminal justice system actually operates on the ground, particularly through the portal of the police. So I was a master's student at the LSE in my very early 20s, and I remember vividly coming back from visiting a friend, and it was late in the evening around the Russell Square area, and I was carrying a holdall, a sports holdall, which had packed inside it all my textbooks and files. And as I was walking down the pavement, suddenly, from my blind side, a police car pulled up, and very sort of, in a very rushed fashion, out jumped out 3 police officers and stopped me. And they asked me what was in my bag. Now, at that time, I had no interest in being a lawyer. I was actually studying international relations, but I had at least enough presence of mind to say to them, "Why are you asking me what's in my bag?" They took that as an act of defiance, and then became very aggressive towards me and insisted that they needed to look in my bag because apparently, and I think, Leslie, this will resonate with your own life experience, I resembled the description of a burglar who had been operating in the local area. So reluctantly, I opened up my bag, and lo and behold, it contained exactly what I said it held. And those police officers looked rather embarrassed when they realized that I wasn't some burglar or somebody up to no good, but actually a postgraduate student. And this is just one example of the way in which, in my own life, I've experienced my interactions with the police. I could give others as well. But the sum total of all of that, and that's taken from experiences in the 70s and 80s and 90s, is that you get the impression that the police have a certain sense of who you are before you open your mouth or before you produce any credentials, based upon the way that you look. And that sense of niggling injustice eats away at you. And so when I eventually became a barrister and did the crossover through the GDL, I decided that I was going to focus on criminal defense work. I thought that was where I could best use whatever skills I had and help out as many people who needed representation as I could get to. Within the first couple of years of being at the bar, I found myself in a robing room at Reading Crown Court. And in that room was a white barrister, what you might call a traditional type barrister in his 60s, who made a comment about Muslim people, which was absolutely vile and disgusting. And being just a couple of years call, I wasn't sure whether I should challenge him, but I said to him across the robing room, "What did you just say?" He immediately hushed. And then a friend of his, a lady who was also quite a senior member of the bar, pulled him away. Later that morning, she came to me and apologized on his behalf. And later still, he turned up in my courtroom as I was sat waiting for my case to be called on, and passed me very quietly a little note apologizing for what he had said, no doubt now very worried that I might report him. And what I'd like to say about that, Brie, is how would I have dealt with it differently? I think today, as a mature man, had I been stopped by the police, I would have been far more combative and insisted that they explain to me exactly why it was they were pulling me up. And as a mature barrister, had I come across an incident like that, I would have utilized the regulations that we have to report that man, because it's absolutely critical that when incidents like that happen, a message goes out that it will not be tolerated and that there are consequences that flow from acting in such an obvious and racist fashion.
Thank you, Joe. Natasha, can I ask you really the same question?
For me, this has been a very difficult question to answer for a number of reasons. Firstly, because I believe that nowadays racism is generally covert. Secondly, because it's not been a single event that I've experienced at the bar, but a multitude of different events and factors that have led me to believe that the profession has systemic racism embedded in it. And thirdly, because of course this is a very open forum and this is being recorded, so therefore the answers that I will give will be genuine answers from my experience, but they will be generalized and no names will be mentioned. The first issue that I have is the assumption that a barrister in this country is a white man. My first experience of othering was at an advocacy weekend at Lincoln's Inn when I was doing my BPTC. A retired judge was speaking to a group of us, mainly white students and myself, and he turned to me and asked me if I was going back to my country to practice after I'm called to the bar. Now, I'm born and raised in Tottenham, as some of you may know. So that assumption for me was deeply offensive, and it was also very, very embarrassing. And it set the tone for the rest of my time at the bar. Loads of people have spoken about, and I too have experienced, being assumed to be anything other than the barrister at court. You're the defendant, or you're a party in the proceedings, or you're a social worker, or if you're lucky, you're a solicitor, but you're never ever the barrister. And this is not just from court staff, this is from other legal professions, including other barristers. There is an idea that people like me have been allowed to enter this profession rather than being entitled to be here, and that I'm supposed to express gratitude to people for giving me a chance by offering me pupillage rather than acknowledging that I got into this profession because I deserve to be here. There's also the superiority that white barristers display against barristers like me. Women will understand this, I think, in particular, but for me as a Black woman, I get it from everywhere, from white women from other minorities, from white men, from Black men, from anybody. When I wake up in the morning before I go to court, not only do I have the stresses of the case that I'm about to be dealing with, but I also have to worry about whether at some point during that day, somebody, either an opponent or court staff or judge, will take a particular disliking to me, most likely because of my race. I am often undermined or patronized, sometimes by opponents in court in front of a judge who doesn't say anything, or sometimes by a judge with no support from other legal professionals. I'm often being told that I'm being ridiculous or that my suggestions are stupid when the law is in my favor, and then I never get an apology after the hearing when the judge confirms that I'm right. There's a lack of visibility of Black barristers as well, which is a problem. We barely see them. Our intellect is never appreciated and respected. And there are other circumstances, for example, being silenced within organisations such as chambers or otherwise. I also sit on the Bar Council. If you have an idea, for example, if it comes out from my mouth, nobody listens. But when a white person parrots my idea, steals it, or they endorse it, that is the only time that I'm actually accepted. And that idea, in fact, I'm not accepted. It's the idea itself that is accepted, and often credited to that other person. So it's just a number of different things at the bar that's basically told me that it's a place where I'm not exactly as welcomed as other people.
That was fantastic, Natasha. I think we can see you do deserve to be at the bar, and that was a very clear picture that you painted. Leslie, can I turn to you?
So I could give examples that are very similar to the examples that you've heard from my colleagues speaking alongside me on this panel. But let me give you a different flavour. So I'm not going to talk about judges, of which some have said to me, in this country, Mr. Thomas, we do things in this way. Nor am I going to talk about you know, nearly every occasion when I've been into court when I was a junior, being assumed to be anything but the barrister. So you're always the defendant, or you're the defendant's brother, or you're the defendant's family member, or you're the clerk, but you're never the barrister. No, I'm not going to talk about that. Those are just too easy. But it's the microaggressions that you receive from colleagues and close colleagues. Now, those of you who know me and know the work that I do, you know that I do human rights work. And you would think, would you not, that if anybody, or if there was a group of lawyers who would be understanding of the trials and tribulations of being Black in a predominantly white profession, would be those civil liberties lawyers. But even those lawyers have microaggressions. So for instance, when you go to an event, why is it that because you're Black and you say you're a barrister, they always assume you do criminal law? Why? You know, why is it that, you know, when you explain that you do a particular type of human rights law, it can never be anything that's thought to be intellectual? But it doesn't stop there. The most embarrassing and horrible situation that I've had is when I had a client of mine ring me in chambers, a client that I had advised on a case for positively. And he said to me, "Leslie, I know I shouldn't be ringing you, but you need to know this." And I said, "What?" He goes, "Your solicitor has taken you off the case and told me that you don't do police law." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Yeah, they instructed another barrister who they put on the case to represent me on a police action." Now, for those of you who don't know me, I've been doing police actions for the last 30 years. It's what I'm known for. And to have a solicitor tell a client, "Oh, Leslie's not an expert in police law, I want to instruct an expert in police law." And then when I discovered the person who they instructed didn't do police law, wasn't a specialist in police law, was just heartbreaking. In that case, the client insisted that I be put back on the case. And in fact, the client revealed in conference what the solicitor had said, and then promptly sacked the solicitor and stuck with me. But these are the sorts of microaggressions. In fact, that's not a microaggression. That's
I was going to say, Leslie, that ain't micro.
These are the sorts of things that we as Black counsel experience. And my colleagues would be shocked, but they happen. And these things happen daily. And I wish I could say this. I wish I could say, these are the things that I experienced years and years ago when I was a junior barrister. But you know what? You know what the tragedy is? They are still happening today. And I see junior members of the bar who confide in me and say to me, "Leslie, this has happened, that has happened," and they are just as bad as when I started at the bar 30 years ago.
Well, I don't know about our audience. I find it quite chilling. I'm going to hand over to Neil now.
We are hearing about the acronym BAME, and in fact, that's the title of this particular event. So Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic. Originally BME in the 1970s to take account of the anti-racist movements, but it seems primarily when the A was added, the Asian, it was used as a statistical term. I'm interested in what the panel think of the term BAME. Leslie, what are your thoughts?
I'm not particularly struck with the expression, and I say that for this reason. Firstly, I fully appreciate that, you know, people of colour do have a different experience from our white counterparts. Totally get that. And if BAME or BAME is a phrase that's used to recognise that people of colour have a different experience, I get it, I understand that. But the problem is, to my mind, and I say this often, I'm not a race expert, but to my mind, it's just another way of othering us, that we are put in an other category collectively. And it's as if we all have the same collective experience. The reality is we don't. We don't. That's not to take away from the experience of, that's not to take away from the experience of some of my black and brown brothers and sisters. But the reality is we do not all have the same experience. And, you know, just to take an example, young black men on the streets of our major cities do have a very different experience because they are black. Young Asian men have a very different experience to young black men. So, you know, to that extent, we can't say that we all have the same experience so that we can be lumped together. We need to be more subtle and recognise the differences.
Joe, what are your thoughts? Do you agree with that? Or what do you think of the term BAME? Joe, you're going to hear this a lot on remote hearings. You haven't got your microphone on. Brilliant.
Just saying, Neil, that personally, I've never been particularly enamoured of the expression or acronym BAME. I think it's a bit of a clumsy expression. I agree with what Leslie's concerns or reservations about that acronym are. Leslie and I are the same age, so we would probably have remembered days back in the 70s when, in fact, when anti-racist struggles, which involved black, brown, and white people across this country, were very much at their height because of the activity of fascists like the National Front. Most of us were content to walk under a banner of being called black, and it was used as a political term which would incorporate all of us, whichever shade or complexion we were. And there was a reason behind that, because at that stage, we were becoming increasingly empowered. We were developing allyships with other communities, but we were also growing in self-confidence in order to resist what was naked and overt and violent racist aggression. As time has gone on, of course, the demographics of the country had changed and different communities have moved into the country latterly. And I think the fabric and tapestry of this nation, in terms of all the individual racial identities, has become increasingly sophisticated. And to that extent, it's outwearing the expression BAME. So there are two things about it which I'd like to say. Firstly, for me, what is particularly important for us to keep in mind is the fact that visible ethnic minorities get a particularly hard time in this country, that even within visible ethnic minorities, the experiences, as Leslie says, are not identical. Because if you are a young black male, you are more likely to be stopped and searched and tasered and treated differently than if you are a young brown male. But if you are a young brown Muslim male, you're more likely to be the victim of Islamophobia than if you are, say, I don't know, a black Muslim male, simply because the police will make assumptions about you and so will racists. So I think it's the visibility of being an ethnic minority which is in fact the touch point for most of us who feel quite rightly sensitive about the difference in treatment. That's the important thing. The second thing, which is a corollary of that, is that the word or acronym BAME does in fact engender a sort of amorphous, homogeneous whole, which does a great disservice to the internal differences within visible minority communities in this country. I think you'll hear Black people will say, why are we lumped in with everybody else who's a visible minority? Asian people will say the same thing. And even within the Asian community, you'll have people from the subcontinent will say, well, I'm a Pakistani Asian, and somebody else will say, I'm an Indian Asian, Bangladeshi Asian, Sri Lankan Asian. And then, of course, you've got the Chinese Asians who often get left out of the conversation. So I think it's a supreme irony, actually, that in an effort to try and promote diversity and racial equality, we have superimposed on all these minority communities an expression which in fact suffocates those differences. So far from achieving diversity, we are suppressing diversity. I would love to see us reach a point in this society where each individual visible minority community can have its attributes celebrated as part of the entirety of the national community, and that the differences between them as well are respected, and that where something affects one particular sub-minority community more acutely than others, that everybody, including the other minority communities, respect and understand that. And just by closing on this point, a simple example, when we have the Black Lives Movement, which has been sparked again into life because of the George Floyd murder, in my view, that should be led by Black people. It should therefore be supported by other minority communities and indeed by the white community as well. But it is something about which there should be some level or measure of ownership by the Black community over that. Just as if there was an issue affecting the Asian community, it should equally be led by them because it's more to do with their lived experiences than anyone else.
No, that's interesting. So, Natasha, both Leslie and Joe seem not too enamoured with the acronym. What are your thoughts?
I hate it too.
Right, so why is that?
I don't like
quite a strong phrase, hate it, yeah?
I actually hate. I agree with what Leslie said about it perpetuating the sense of othering, i.e. that there is everybody and then there's ethnic minority. But one thing that's particularly interesting about the othering is that it reinforces the fact that white people do not have to see themselves in racial terms. And this is problematic. It's problematic because it means that white people do not see the privileges that they have simply for being white. The fact that they'll never have negative assumptions or stereotypes or connotations placed upon them because of the color of their skin. The fact that in this country, you will automatically pretty much belong anywhere and everywhere in any institution or organization, unless it is for one of those few organizations which has been set up specifically by and for people of other races. The fact that you will never have to worry about how somebody else might feel about your race. The fact that your race will never hold you back. The fact that the majority of people in your chambers, if you want to come to the bar, will share your race. And the fact that if anybody suggests that your behavior, your recruitment practices, your work allocation is racially biased, you will have a number of white colleagues who will be defending you. Without recognizing these things, you cannot tackle racism because you need to see where the advantage is in order to be able to see where the disadvantage is. I also agree with what Leslie has said in respect of the fact that it lumps ethnic minorities together, and I hear what both Joe and Leslie have said about Black people and Asian people, men in particular, and the assumptions that are made there. One thing that's quite interesting though is, I just wanted to bring it up, it's about women, and women in particular. We have this two-pronged issue, ethnic minority women, and I can speak from a Black woman's perspective, of invisibility and hypervisibility. So we are often not seen at all, particularly if we're doing anything good, but if we're doing something bad, we are very, very visible. And the likelihood of anybody coming down on us like a ton of bricks is very high. And that is something that has been a massive concern for me in the profession. I have had what I used to think was an irrational fear of having a complaint made against me that required BSB involvement. And when I read, I think it was a couple of years ago, an article in Council magazine by Desiree Artesi, basically saying that statistically, Black and minority ethnic barristers have more cases upheld against them by the BSB, I thought, okay, my fear is not actually irrational. It's very rational. So
yeah. So I think we've all three of us have done the typical lawyer thing and criticised the heading, BAME. So what phrase, and this can be quite difficult on the spot, but what phrase or term do you think is more appropriate? Because some commentators, for example, want to see it changed to something just neutral, as in ethnic minorities, to try and encompass everything, and to appreciate the differences that Leslie was speaking about. But what sort of phrase would you want, Leslie?
Well, I'm going to take this from my good friend and colleague at the Bar Standards Board, Amit Popat, that if you use the word BAME, we can use the word WAME, white and majority ethnic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to say, you know, the bottom line is it's othering. The reality is, black, even though when we were initially called black as a way of taking away our humanity, when people of African origin in Africa, before slavery, we didn't look at ourselves in terms of black, in terms of shades. We were just people. We were human beings. But black does have a political connotation now, and I'm prepared to embrace my blackness. I do like the expression people of color, because it emphasizes that we are people. It emphasizes our humanity. These are difficult concepts. I suppose what I'm saying is, whatever you label us is not the issue. The issue is how we are treated, and the differences in terms of how somebody who walks in black skin is treated from somebody who walks around in white skin. That's the issue, not so much the labels, to my mind. Yeah.
In fact, Leslie, what Joe was saying about each minority communities and their attributes to be celebrated, that's exactly what you're saying. How they're treated is the key, and that's what people should focus on. Yeah. Joe, what are your thoughts on the phrase BAME, and what would you replace it with then? Well, we know your thoughts on BAME, but what would you replace it with?
Neil, I don't think you're ever going to be able to come up with an acronym or an abbreviation which is going to satisfy everyone. I think that there is still an important role to be played in saying that there is a disproportionate impact on those who are visible ethnic minorities. So whether it's people of color or you use VEM, visible ethnic minorities, for me, it's two sides of the same coin. I think there is a distinction to be drawn, because on the receiving end of racism and racial inequality, those who are perpetrating that sort of menace within our society don't spend too much time making a distinction between whether you are brown or black. If you are of a different color to them and they are white, that is the principal distinction that they draw. And therefore, I don't think we can come up with anything, because ultimately, there is a need to document, record, and keep some sort of statistical record of the way in which people of color are being treated in this society. And for those purposes, if for nothing else, we're going to have some way of describing them. My concern is that we don't simply lump everyone together, that as and when we can, we draw that differentiation out, which is a recognition and a respect for the differences between people of different backgrounds within the visible ethnic minorities.
Okay. And Natasha, very quickly, you say you hate BAME, so what would you replace it with?
It's a tricky one because, as the others have said, it's going to be quite difficult to find a word that everyone's going to be happy with. But I do think that what is important is that when we're looking at things like statistics and treatment, we do look at statistics and we look at treatment in respect of each ethnic minority that's out there. I think part of the problem that we have is that by lumping it all together, we make it sound as if we all have the same opportunities or we're all treated in the same way. generally bad, which isn't necessarily the case. I mean, if you look at the diversity at the Bar 2019 report, it states there's a slightly greater proportion of Asian and Asian British practitioners at the bar compared to the proportion of Asian and Asian British individuals in the UK working age population. The same can be said for mixed and multiple ethnic backgrounds. The opposite is found for those of Black British backgrounds and those of other ethnic groups. So that is an example of one part, particularly of our profession, where we really do need to be breaking these statistics down and thinking to ourselves, what is it, why is it that particularly Black barristers are having a particular problem in accessing and staying in the profession?
No, that's interesting, Natasha. Well, and speaking of the statistics, Brie, and so you had a question.
Right, straight into my question, which I'll get to the point. As you say, the BSB diversity statistics show that if you take people of colour as a group, as against the working population, the statistics start to look like we've made lots of progress, because it's 13.6% as against 14.4% across the population. But when you start to drill down, particularly in relation to Black barristers, we know the statistics look really bad. That once we start to move up through the profession, if we look at silks, the statistics for all people of colour look much worse, and particularly for Black barristers. When we look at the judiciary, look in the tribunals, it looks reasonably good. We look across to the courts, it doesn't look so good, and as you move up the ranks of seniority of courts, it gets steadily worse and worse for people of colour collectively, and particularly for Black members of the legal profession. So what I wanted to ask all of you is, what is the impact of seeing the limited progress and the lack of progression ahead of you as you're moving through your career? So perhaps if I can start with you, Natasha.
I think it's concerning. I think the statistics for me show that there is racial bias within our profession. Some of it is conscious, but most of the time it's unconscious. And for me, I think it gives me a fear that when it comes to my progression in the bar, there might be obstacles put in front of me because of my race that would mean that my progression is slower, or that I have to do it on my own without support from other people. And that if I apply for certain roles, such as if I want to be a QC someday, that might be a difficult one for me to obtain because of my race. I think the statistics show a lot in terms of access to the profession, but they particularly are stark in terms of our progression within the profession. One thing I believe is highly likely is that there is discrimination in the allocation of work. The reason why I say it's highly likely is that we don't have any statistics on it. I have had conversations with Black people who have told me that their regular stream of a particular type of work for a particular solicitor has magically disappeared and fallen into the hands of a more junior white man. I've also heard of people being looking around them and querying why someone at their same level is getting better work than they are, or they've been taken out for drinks with solicitors, whereas that Black candidate has not been. Which of course feeds into progression at the bar, because if you're not getting the right type of work, how are you going to be able to put yourself forward in different ways? You need to also look at chambers. Who is being put forward and promoted by chambers to be ranked in the legal directories? Who is being told that they should be considered becoming a QC and who is not? For example, when somebody questions, maybe it's because of my race, maybe it is. What kind of responses do they receive? Take an example of, let's say, James Forsyth, who's been chosen by Chambers as one of the people they want to try and get ranked in the directories this year. And he was called to the bar in 2007, and his cases have been unremarkable. Now then you've got Oluwafemi Adebayo, who was called to the bar in 2004, but has not been chosen. Now Oluwafemi might have been in the most talked about cases of that year and the last few years, cases that he's got himself by building networks with local solicitors. He goes for a drink with a colleague in his chambers, and he says, I don't understand why they've decided to try and get James into the directories and not me. I'm more senior than him. I've had better cases. I think it's because of my race. Now, the other person, white person, how do they respond? They respond saying, do you know what, that's a possibility actually. Why don't we sit down and try and find a way in which we can raise this with the management committee? Or do they say, well, maybe it's because like James's cases are more intellectually like stimulating than yours, or maybe his cases show a range of competencies that yours maybe don't, or maybe like the solicitors that instructed James are more better known or just better than yours, or is there any other excuse other than race? I think my central point is that at the bar, we need to start talking about race properly. We need white people, including allies and non-allies, to come together and start feeling comfortable about listening to these accounts and actually trying to do things to address things. Otherwise, we're still going to have the same statistics in 20 years' time.
Thank you, Natasha. Leslie.
My heart sinks when I look at our senior judiciary. I've been at the bar for 31 years, 30 years at Garden Court Chambers in tomorrow, which is the 1st of July. Yeah,
congratulations.
30 years, thank you, 30 years tomorrow at Garden Court Chambers. And in those 30, when I first started, there were a lot of black barristers, but the black barristers that there were 30 years ago were congregated in sets together. You know, we were on the whole not perceived to be in the best sets of chambers. But the barristers back then, they were good, and they were good because they had to fight. And they didn't get the recognition that they deserved back then. You know, when I think about the first black silk, John Roberts, when was that? That was 1988. Think about it, 1988. When I started at the bar. Now, here's the thing. For those of you who are sitting watching this and have the perception, but the law is colorblind, the law just deals with things on merit. Law doesn't look very colorblind to somebody from my position. When I look and I see that the two top universities in this country appear to have a problem with the recruitment of black students, and particularly black British young men. When I look at the profession across the whole, and I see that, you know, the commercial bar, the chancery bar, the tax bar appears to have a problem in terms of recruiting black people. When I look and I consider the fact that most of the senior judiciary tends to be recruited from those ranks and those universities, and when you get to the High Court, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, and if I have to appear in those venues, all the judges are white, and you tell me the law is colorblind, I say to you, who are you kidding?
Thank you very much, Leslie. And Joe?
I think we have to start from the premise that the bar and the judiciary, being a part of society, will reflect all the ills that we see in wider society. We have to start with the realistic acceptance that the bar and the judiciary are not immune. that notwithstanding the fact that the very values that underpin what barristers do, namely that they're supposed to be working for justice, making sure that people are equal before the law, that everyone has a fair crack of the whip, that people's voices will be heard, that in reality, of course, the bar is but a microcosm of what is going on outside. And I think once we make that acceptance, those of us who are within the bar, particularly those who are senior in the bar and hold power, I think we will have made progress. Right now, I believe one of the reasons why we are holding ourselves back from making faster progress than we are is because of the prevalent delusion that somehow we are inoculated against racism and discriminatory practices. We are not. And just as the bar and the judiciary do indeed reflect the attitudes that we see outside, so also they reflect the structures. One of the most important things I feel about the recent Black Lives Movement is that it has shown again in sharp relief that the focus needs to be not just on attitudinal racism, but upon systemic and structural racism. Racism is about power. In the same way that rape is about power, it's not about sex, it's about the exertion of power by one person over another. And I think that now that we appreciate that there needs to be a very close scrutiny of the way in which our structures within the bar and the judiciary are set up, the time has come for us to start asking the really hard questions. For example, why is it that Black barristers make slower progress sometimes than Asian barristers when it comes to taking silk? Why is it that we have some Asian senior judges in this country, including in the Court of Appeal, but we don't have any Black judges? What is going on? Is there some sort of a hierarchy operating whereby certain people of color are treated slightly more preferentially than other people of color? Because as a person who has given their life in many ways to fighting discrimination against all people of color, it disturbs me deeply to look across and see that Black men and women in the bar and the judiciary are not making the same progress at the same rate as, say, Asian people. It's not right. It's got to stop. And I need to know, why is that happening? Are there assumptions made by those who hold power that somehow Black people are not able and that some Asian people are more able? Is this the sort of differential racism which is operating within our institutions? It needs close scrutiny. And I think, Brie, as well, when we talk about the way in which institutional racism operates, we must understand that it's not just the Metropolitan Police, it's not just other institutions within civil society, that if the premise is that we are no more immune from racism than any other organization or profession, then it leads us to the sad and inevitable conclusion that the bar and judiciary may well also have vestiges of institutional racism, and it needs to be rooted out. So I think a more targeted approach would help us all. When we're having these discussions, it's almost as though we are in a mirror image reflecting the points we made earlier about the importance of not lumping us all in together, because I can see that there is a real problem affecting particular minorities more than it's affecting others. And I think I don't want to make the mistake of us falling into the trap of thinking, well, some people are doing okay, so they don't need any more support, and others are the only ones who need support. They all need support, but support ought to be targeted.
Thank you, Joe. I think it's very interesting to reflect, as Karen said at the beginning, we focused on women last year, knowing been 100 years of women at the bar, and we can see the progression that's been made. Not enough, but progression. In fact, the first Black barrister was Christian Frederick Cole. He was a member of Lincoln's Inn, Inner Temple. He joined the Inn in September 1879 and was called to the bar 4 years after that. And if we compare the progression, I think it's a very stark demonstration of the picture that you've all been painting. If I hand back to Neil.
Now, going back to the topic, much of the self-employed bar has been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's fair to say from what you all say, it seems people of colour, BAME barristers, seem to be practicing a large portion in the publicly funded sector. So focusing on them, even taking into account the recent study from Oxford University that people in the BAME category are twice as likely to die from COVID than white people, do you feel that the government has done enough to address the increased risks for BAME barristers and indeed other court users? And if not, what do you think more can be done? Joe, what are your thoughts? You're on mute.
I think my view about this, Neil, is that one has to start on the understanding that there is indirect discrimination against people who are of colour at the bar. I am a criminal defence practitioner, a lifelong practitioner, last 27 years. I think there are two reasons why the facts and the statistics show that there is, in a sense, an overrepresentation of those barristers of colour that we do have at the bar in areas of publicly funded work. The first is that they have been excluded, and I mean actively excluded, from being able to penetrate those corners of the bar which offer the most lucrative type of practice and work. That's to say the commercial work, chancery work, tax work, and all of those other areas where you get the best funded pupilages, and that the evidence shows those pupilages are going overwhelmingly to white young men and women who go to certain universities. And so there is an exclusion going on which prevents people of color being able to get into those pockets. The second is this, and I think perhaps I'm an embodiment of this particular example. There are people like me who came to the bar because they were motivated by certain ideals, perhaps you describe us as idealistic, but that we felt that it was important for society to become more progressive and more fair and more equal. And so we gravitated towards those areas of practice where we felt that we would have the greatest opportunity to reach the most people. So I decided that I wanted to go into criminal defense work because I felt that there was a need to help people, particularly those, as I found along the way, who came from minority backgrounds, who were disadvantaged in some way, to give a voice to those voiceless. It was one of my motivations for going into that. And I don't regret it for a moment, because I feel it's a high impact area for someone like me to have committed themselves to. But that has resulted in fact, a picture across the bar of an over-concentration of people of color in some areas, such as criminal work, family work, police law, employment law. But then in other areas, we see a dearth of those same people. And this is a problem because this is supposedly one bar. It's a problem also because if one thinks about career progression, those who tend to take silk in this job and those who tend to enter the judiciary, particularly at the higher echelons, are often drawn more from those areas of work which are paid better. That's to say the commercial ranks, the chancery ranks. And there's good reason for that. They get the best exposure to high court judges in the earlier part of their careers. They often have better connections with the judiciary through their own chambers. They are therefore able to get the sort of exposure and practice building which helps them to advance their careers. And of course, they happen to reflect, lo and behold, the sorts of people that you see at the senior levels of the judiciary, and therefore there's a welcome home for them. So what we have here is a self-perpetuating elite. It is a vicious circle or a virtuous circle, depending upon which end of the lens you're looking at it. And this needs to be broken. We've got to find ways actually to make sure that we aren't all pocketed in one part of the bar, that we are spread across the bar. Why? Because if you take what Leslie said to you earlier this evening about the assumptions that are made about Black people, and sometimes also about Asian people too, that they are not intellectually up to the job of being able to perform apparently commercial work and civil work, which so so I'm beginning to hear is apparently more intellectually demanding. I'm not quite sure where that comes from, because anyone who's ever practiced in a criminal court at a high level will understand very well that it requires a host of skills, including high intellectual acumen. But the assumption is that they're not good enough to do that sort of work. And we've got to look at those statistics, understand where the problem is, and start asking those chambers those tough questions.
But quickly, Joe, just on that, you've talked about the overconcentration. Eventually, you're going to have to go back to court. Are you worried that there are increased risks for you?
There are two worries I have, Neil. One is I'll be looking left and right and notice that there are fewer people of colour in the courtroom with me. Why? Because the process of attrition, which has happened to the junior bar most acutely, consequent to the fact that the government has chronically underfunded publicly funded work. So legal aid has been slashed so much that people who don't have much in the way of means to start with, who manage through sheer grit and determination to get themselves into the bar, after a few years are driven out of the bar because they can't afford to stay. We are finding now in fast forward those problems happening to us in the middle of COVID. So I'm fearful that we're going to lose a lot of those people. I'm also concerned that when you look at the differential impact of COVID on Asian and Black people, we are now having an additional anxiety. You heard the microaggression that Leslie was talking about earlier. This is a form of microaggression which isn't actually caused by any individual, but is caused by the environment in which we are now operating. Simply put, Neil, when I go back to my next trial, which will probably be in September, and be a 5-handed murder in Leeds Crown Court, unlike my white fellow Silts in that case, there will be an additional anxiety I will feel in my stomach as I go in, thinking to myself, if I pick up the virus here, I am far more likely to die of it than any of the other guys who are operating in this courtroom. And that means that my stress levels will be that much more enhanced, about which the government have done precious little.
Yeah, that's interesting. Natasha, from a family law perspective, do you think the government has done enough to alleviate risks of going back for you?
No, and I think there are two risks in this, of course. There's the health risk and there's, of course, financial risks, which are kind of interlinked in a way. But if I just deal with the health risk first, I, on behalf of the Black Barristers Network, spoke to the Young Barristers Committee a couple of weeks ago about the effect that COVID-19 has been having on junior Black barristers after we'd got some feedback from some of our membership. And effectively, main concerns were the fact that COVID-19 has such a disproportionate effect on us, not just us, but our families too. So there is a massive concern as to the safety of courts. This could be, in some respects, alleviated a bit if each individual court centre published online their risk assessments, which they've undertaken in individual court centres, so that those barristers can make their own informed decision as to whether or not they want to take the risk and go to court. But I think this should also be a two-pronged thing, where chambers look at work allocation. They really do ask people who wants to go to court and who doesn't. And then with that, looks at whether or not they can provide written work for hearings, or give people hearings that are guaranteed to be remote hearings, so that they can still earn money without having to take the risk on themselves. And that again goes back to financial issues and the fact that COVID-19 has had such a massive effect on barristers in respect of our earning capacity, but particularly for people who are working in the publicly funded section, and as has been said, are particularly Black and minority ethnic barristers. This is something that the government has completely and utterly overlooked. I think they have ignored us, we do not exist, and it's very, very unfortunate. But there are some things, like I've just said, that chambers can do and government can do to make things slightly, ever so slightly, better for barristers like ourselves.
Thanks for that. Leslie, do you agree with Joe and Natasha about this risk and the increased risk and the need for it to be addressed?
Yes, I do. I mean to say, you know, both Natasha and Joe, I couldn't put it any better than how they've put it. You just need to look at the recently published stats in relation to the impact of COVID on Black people. You know, if you are a, you know, if you are of African descent, you know, you're 4 times as likely to be impacted by this virus. Now, if we just stop and think for one moment, we've already accepted, because it's just the facts, that there aren't that many of us in the areas of the bar which are heavily insulated from COVID because of the fact that they won't be, or there isn't the same need to be going to court. So I'm talking about if you've got a heavy commercial paperwork practice, as opposed to if you're somebody who's trying to make your living every day by going to the magistrates or the local crown courts, and that's how you make your bread and butter. So you know, it's impacting on us in so many ways. And as I say, Joe and Natasha have already made the points, but you know, you just need to look at the stats. The stats speak for themselves.
Yeah, no, I agree, Leslie. Excellent. Brie, over to you.
Unmuting always helps. So I just wanted to ask you all, with the impact of lockdown, so many images of essential workers who were people of colour dying, and the Black Lives Matter movement fueled by the horrific killing of George Floyd in the US. If we then look to the UK, we can look back historically, and it really is historically these days, to the failures to achieve justice for Stephen Lawrence. But more recently, just as examples, we have the behaviour of some police officers during the investigation into the murders of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry, and the controversy surrounding how Belly Manjinga came to be infected with COVID. It feels like now is a really important moment so far as race in the UK is concerned. What do you feel our role, and I mean all of us by this, as lawyers should be at the moment? Sorry, I was lost track of who I was posing that one to first. Leslie.
Thank you, Brie. I think it's really important that we make our voices heard. And that's what I've been trying to do. I've been using the platform and the privilege, the honour that I've been given recently of becoming a professor of law, because it just means that people, you know, who wouldn't otherwise listen may listen to what I have to say. I think we need to call out these differences and call out these injustices. And but it's one thing calling it out as a Black man or a Black woman. What's more important, I think, because, you know, we are in a minority position, it's important for our white brothers and sisters to stand alongside us and to call it out as well, and not to feel that they are under attack, because this isn't attacking white people as individuals. This is just telling it as it is. This is explaining that, you know, we are living in a society with inherent unfairnesses, injustices. You just need to look at the figures. And it's being, dare I use the word, being brave enough to accept that there are injustices, and not just think about this as just this moment in time which will pass. This is a real opportunity for all of us to stand together and make a difference. So the question is, how do we make a difference? What can we do? Let me make a few suggestions, and I'm sure the rest of the panel can add to the few that I mentioned. And I repeat, I'm not a race expert. This is something I've just been thinking about. But I think the first thing we can do, all of us can do, is we can try to educate ourselves. We can try to educate ourselves in relation to why things are, without just accepting, well, there'll always be like that, or saying to ourselves, well, what can I do? There's nothing I can do. If we all said there's nothing we could do, nothing would ever be achieved. So educating ourselves. So what should we do to educate ourselves? Well, there are a number of fantastic teaching materials around at the moment. Firstly, you know, there are some great books. I implore everybody to pick up Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I put on the chat a fantastic podcast series that's just started with Don Lemon. It started on the 18th of June on CNN. You get it on wherever you pick up your podcasts, on silence is not an option. And, you know, there are a ton of books which we can share later on in terms of, you know, racism. So educate ourselves. And then once, you know, once you have some knowledge, take action. Call, you know, if you see something that's not right, don't just turn a blind eye to it. Call it out. You don't need to call it out in a hostile way, but you need to call it out. You can't let it stand. And finally, this is the final point I will make. Those of us who are in the legal profession, and I'm talking about the legal profession broadly, whether you're you know, in a solicitor's office, barristers' chambers, and you know, on the bench, a member of the judiciary, doesn't matter, in the tribunal, there are things we see all the time which need to be called out. Don't leave it to the next person, and don't think because it's not you, you don't need to say anything if you see something that's wrong. Silence when you see something that's wrong is, to my mind, just as bad. It's being complicit in an unjust system. So those are the things that I would share.
Thank you, Leslie. Joe?
Brie, I'd agree with everything that Leslie said. I think, you know, there are many people listening to this discussion now. Some of you will be students, some of you will be in the early years of your practice at the bar, or indeed to become solicitors. All of you will have skin in the game. All of you have a vested interest in making sure that the legal profession does what it says on the tin. We're guided by certain values, by certain ethics. We're supposed to believe in fairness and equality. We can't just mouth those words. We have to practice those words in every day of our working lives. Lawyers historically have been positive agents for change. There is something about being a lawyer, whether you're a member of the bar, you're a solicitor. There is clearly some sort of urge behind the job, something that drives you to want to do something to help others. It's that instinct which we're really encouraging you now to harness at a time like this, when there is such tumult in the world, that we need sanity, reason. We need people who are good communicators and those who are willing to stand up for the values that we all believe in. Not for nothing are some of the most important historical figures from the Black and Asian community, figures such as Mandela, such as Nehru, such as Jinnah, such as Obama, people who were in fact trained as lawyers. Why is it important? Because as a lawyer, you walk with certain gifts that you hone in the course of your career. The first is your ability to analyze situations, to deconstruct situations, whether it's to do with the facts or the law. It's that analytical ability, which means that you don't sleepwalk into irrational thinking that could cause you to have prejudice against other people. You operate on the basis of reason. Secondly, lawyers generally should be good communicators. And there's nothing like a good communicator in order to persuade people to do the right thing. When we're in a situation as we are now across the globe, where people are shouting and screaming for good reason, the voices that will always be remembered are the ones who stood up and spoke with passion, but who were able to articulate those points so that they hit home, not just with their own people, that's to say the minority from which they spring, but with the wider audience, for the very reason that Leslie's articulated. This is an important cause for everyone, not just for Black and brown people. This is about white people as well joining in. And there was nothing more heartening that I saw when I saw those protests, both in the States and here, to see the numbers of white people standing shoulder to shoulder with Black people and with brown people, because they felt that this was a matter of humanity, not just a matter of race. And it's when we globalize the concept of humanity so that we extinguish the differences in our colors, and people start to see themselves first and foremost as human beings, treating other people as human beings, that I think we will genuinely start to make progress. And lawyers ought to be at the vanguard of that. So Brie, to answer your question, I think we have an important role to play, so important I can't actually overstate it. We need more people involved in this, and it shouldn't just be a few voices who emerge from time to time, but there should be a collective cacophony of sound coming from people right across the bar, and indeed, very importantly, from the judiciary as well, because this is a cause in which they have a vested interest too.
Thank you, Joe. Natasha?
I agree with what's been said by both Joe and Leslie in respect of the fact that in the legal profession, we are in a position where we should try our hardest to do more and do better. And also that it's not just for ethnic minority barristers and solicitors to do the work, but it's for everybody, including white people, to do the work. But I do think part of that is going to require the first step. And I think the first step is seeing and recognizing the discrimination that happens in our society, both the overt and also the covert. I've been reading, or listening to a book called White Fragility, which is written by a white person, to try and understand why white people feel so uncomfortable and defensive when talking about race. And the author talks about color blindness and describes it as a new form of racism. The problem with being colorblind and suggesting that I don't see race is because white people then assume that we are like them and they project their reality onto us. So if when I'm walking down the street, I don't get stopped and searched, you probably won't get stopped and searched. Or if I'm applying for a particular job and you apply for that job, we'll both be assessed on the same standard. And therefore, the only racism that they really see is the overt racism where someone is being attacked and someone is saying, I am attacking you because I'm a racist person and I don't like your race. So for a start, I think we need to work on actually starting to see colour, talking about colour, understanding how people use colour overtly and covertly to discriminate against other people. And then you can start to do the work in respect of that. I mean, that's even particularly important for example, when you're looking at something so overt as police brutality in the United Kingdom. So you'll have a lot of people who would say, police brutality against black men in the United Kingdom is such a horrible thing. Look at this video, it's really horrible. But then you'll have somebody, sometimes white, sometimes Asian, sometimes even black, who will turn around and say, yes, I can see that that person was stopped by the police and they are black, but maybe, just maybe, there is a lot of drug dealing going on in that area perpetrated by black people. So maybe they were justified in treating that person the way that they treated them. And maybe when they manhandled them a little bit, it was completely understandable. And maybe it's not a racist. So therefore, we need to start to get to a position where we can actually think about and talk about these sorts of issues. Start to understand that people are treated differently because of their race. And then we can start actually doing the work, particularly as lawyers, to try and create a better world for everybody.
Thank you, Natasha. Neil?
Yeah, well, Natasha, interesting. You talk about making this better world. So just briefly, what would you like to see happen for this better world in the legal profession, for there to be this fundamental shift?
I think there needs to be a number of things. Leading on from what I just said, I think we need to start talking about race. I think colourblindness needs to die, in the sense that we need to start recognising that people are treated differently because of their race. We also need to start listening to other people when they say that, and starting to spot things. And when I say spot things, I don't just mean spotting what other people are doing and calling it out. That is definitely what needs to be done. But I think all of us, including myself, I check myself all the time, we need to be looking within ourselves and think, what prejudices do we hold against other people? What assumptions, automatic, unconscious assumptions do we have when we see people? So if, for example, you were to see a Black person in court, do you automatically think that that person is the defendant? Or do you actually think that they could be a legal professional? Or if you have an applicant who is coming in, applying to join your chambers, do you honestly assess them properly and fairly on the basis of themselves and what they've said? Or do you prefer another candidate because of coded words? Like, I think the other candidate was better than this Black candidate because that candidate was more polished, or that candidate seemed like they had more of an intellectual flair than the other candidate, or I feel like that candidate would fit into our chambers, my all-white chambers. And that's why I think that we should take them on. And the same will go up and up when it comes to judicial appointments and QC appointment, etc., etc. I think when we get to a stage where people actually have worked on their internal bias, we all have internal biases. Apparently, it's a natural thing to do with us trying to keep ourselves safe and hunter-gatherer and whatever. But once we all started to work on those things, then we can really, really start to make change in the profession. So I think when we start talking about race properly, actually doing something about it, recognizing and being honest about our own biases, then I'll feel like things are getting a bit better.
And Joe, how would you think this cacophony can be raised to create a fundamental shift?
I think, Neil, there are two things that we need to do. Number one, whilst we can bank the progress that we have made, and we have made some progress. I mean, when I started at the bar, the concept of equality and diversity was completely alien. It wasn't in any way integrated into the work of the bar's committees or anywhere else. And there certainly wasn't any BSB guidance on it. So yes, we've made certain progress, but I think we have ended up in a place where we have created so many taxonomies. We've compartmentalized race and diversity in such a way that we find ourselves ticking boxes. And when we feel we've ticked enough boxes, we feel that we've done our job and the job is over. There's no more progress to be made because by our own metric, we've achieved our objectives. But race and racial inequality doesn't actually work like that for all the reasons that we've heard already, whether it's to do with unconscious bias, whether it's to do with conscious bias, whether it's to do with the institutional structure of race, which sometimes is difficult to put your finger on, other than identifying the white faces within the senior judiciary and wondering why there aren't any people of colour in any great numbers. We can't just rely on tick boxing. We've got to do more. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say, as a concrete way of trying to eliminate these problems, is addressing the issue of leadership. It's the elephant in the room. If you look across the various structures of the bar and the judiciary, and by that I mean everything from the top end of the judiciary going down to the way in which the Inns of Court themselves are set up, to the way in which the Bar Council operates, to the specialist bar associations that populate our profession, and then down to chambers level, have a good hard look at the colour of the leadership. And start asking yourself the question, why is it that despite the fact that we have 14% of the bar being people of colour, we don't seem to have 14% of the leadership at those levels being people of colour? Why is it that we seem to have made a certain amount of progress and then gone right up, banging our heads against that glass ceiling? What is the reason for the resistance at that top level? because it's really important, actually, that if we are going to signal as an institution, as a profession, that we are serious about having racial equality as part of the fabric of what we do on a day-to-day basis, we need to change leadership structures. And there's a reason why it helps. When you have people in senior positions of leadership who come from the very backgrounds that you purport that you want to help, you will find more often than not that because they have lived those experiences, they will be more attentive to the issues in hand, and they will be more serious and earnest in remedying those problems. You can't actually change the system by shouting up from below. You have to have those champions at the top who will then change the culture within those institutions so that racism gets stamped out, and then we move beyond anti-racism into promoting genuine racial equality. So for me, one of the biggest challenges for the next decade is, are we going to see real change in leadership, or are we going to have more of the same?
No, interesting leadership, Joe. Very, very, very interesting. Leslie, just one change that you'd make to address what's happening.
Oh, that's a difficult question. I think what I would like to see, I would like to see every recruitment panel be trained not in terms of what's legally permissible in terms of avoiding breaching the Equality Act. I don't think that goes far enough. You know, it's quite ironic, isn't it, that organisations, you know, talk about in terms of equality and not breaching the Equalities Act. No. We expect that. What I would like to see is going much further than that, and everybody being trained in terms of being anti-racist, what that means, white fragility, what that means, you know, white privilege, what that means, you know, because until these concepts are embraced, we're always going to have a situation whereby it's believed that the system works on the meritocracy, and it doesn't. That's the problem. You know, the whole system of the bar and the profession is based on what I perceive to be a myth, a meritocracy. It doesn't work like that, not in reality.
Yeah, and in fact, we've had many questions about recruitment, so it's interesting that's one area that you think should be addressed. Now, we were going to finish now, but we've had so many questions from everyone that we're going to extend it a little bit to try and get some of those questions in, because I think it's interesting to be able to answer those, and I think it's important to be able to answer those questions. So, Brie, I understand you've got a question that
I have, and I hope our panel have some sense of the amazing conversations that are going on chat and the Q&A, and we will try and capture this stuff and find another way to share it with people. But the question we had in fact, ahead of this, we know that retention of people of colour at the bar is a problem, particularly in relation to women. We also know that barristers who are people of colour are overrepresented in low-paid specialisms. Sometimes it's because of the reality of funding of courts and tribunal services. Survival at the bar requires a change of practice or specialism. What role do you think that specialist bar associations can play in retaining our barristers of colour within the profession? Should they be challenged on their rules of membership that require established practices? Should they be making training and networking available to people wanting to refocus their practices? Should they be putting events out specifically for those looking to move into other areas of practice? So, Joe, would you like to start with that?
I think, Brie, it depends very much on what sort of chambers you're located in. So if you're in a chambers which is mixed and offers different types of work, say, for example, Leslie's chambers at Garden Court. There's more scope for lateral movement, and you'd need to be encouraged to do that by your clerks. You'd need that sort of level of support. If you're in a chambers like mine, where it's pure criminal work, that option isn't so easily available, and then you might end up in the position as a junior barrister knocking on the doors of other chambers, but not having a sufficiently robust profile to be able to get admission. So I think that there are real structural challenges there. For me, I think the important thing is talk to people who are from minority backgrounds and ask them, how do you see your career evolving? You know, ceteris paribus, everything else being equal, you don't have a financial calamity. How would you envisage your career evolving, and what sort of support do you need? I think there's a tendency for us to assume far too much. There's a tendency for us to talk down, particularly to the junior bar, in the sense that we know better because we've been through the system. Well, the reality, of course, for those in the junior bar these days is very different from the reality as it was when I was at the junior end. And the demands and difficulties are far more acute financially, in terms of the fact that we've got so many barristers, but a limited amount of work. It's difficult to make a living, and the level of attrition is testament to the fact that people are simply shrugging their shoulders and giving up. We need support. We need support for people. We need practice management in a real sense. We need oversight of that practice management by equality and diversity officers situated within individual chambers who are able to monitor what is going on, so that if, for example, there is favoritism operating, a white senior clerk is giving better quality work to white members of chambers, and other individuals who may be of color or women are being left out in the cold, it shouldn't simply slide by. It should be picked up on. So in a sense, although we imagine in that idealistic world, that world that we are all, as Leslie was saying, the myth of meritocracy and the myth of us being based upon concepts of fairness and equality, the reality is actually we need to police ourselves, not in a bad way, not in the way of people always being second guessed, but we can't simply leave it. Just like when the press simply couldn't be left to regulate themselves and they needed some oversight, I think the bar similarly needs some form of oversight, and more than just what the BSB provides. We need within individual chambers, people who are equality and diversity officers taking an active role. They've got to be respected in that role. They've got to be resourced in that role so that they can monitor what's going on, because until you can identify where the problems lie, you're a long way away from fixing them.
Leslie, I think you waved. Was that an indication you wanted to comment on this question?
Yes, and can I support what Joe has just said and add this? It's got to be more than just tick boxes. There has to be a genuine attempt to want change. And I think particularly those parts of the profession, whether that be within solicitors, firms or barristers' chambers, when you take a good look at yourself, and look, the reality is into this day and age, when we've got the transparency that we can go onto a chamber's website and we can see who you are. You know, you've all got your profiles, your photographs up. We can see if your chambers is predominantly white. Your photos are on the website. We know who you are, right? We need to have a system whereby those sets of chambers, right, you're not diverse simply because you have black receptionists, or you know, you've got one or two black clerks. That doesn't make you a diverse working environment. You need to acknowledge and be self-aware and be honest with yourself. Why is it that, you know, in 2020, we have only one black person in our chambers, or we have no black people in our chambers? Why is it? Those questions need to be asked, and they need to be asked by our white brothers and sisters in these chambers. You know, we can't, you know, remember, we are on the outside. We can, you know, we're knocking, we're trying to get in. And unless there's a real willingness from those in those chambers or in those firms to be asking these difficult questions. And here's the thing, and let me finish with this, and this will be the last thing I say. In the States, America, for all of its problems, when it comes to corporate accountability, it's different because they have a system whereby if you don't have proper numbers in your system, certain large corporations will not instruct certain firms. You know, that's the sort of governance that they have. Now, I'm not saying we need to adopt that system whole place, but it's interesting, isn't it?
Thank you, Leslie. Are you all willing to carry on for a bit longer? Because we've got loads of questions, if you all can. I'm going to ask another one and then hand over to Neil to ask a couple. So, an anonymous question: what suggestions do the panelists have to assist junior barristers and solicitors having the difficult discussions with management about racism and how to improve diversity within their organisation?
Should I start? Because I'm junior.
Please, Natasha.
Okay, so disclaimer, I moved to Garden Court Chambers from a different chambers, which I was at for 5 years. And part of the reason why I moved is because I really wanted to be in a place that is diverse. So I had the experience of being in a place that is diverse and also experience of being a place that is not diverse. In terms of advice that I would give about challenging these things, I think you need to get allies in chambers if you can, some senior allies that can actually back you with these sorts of things. The reason why I say that is, as I have said earlier in the talk, I've had loads of times where I've been ignored. There's also needs to be an appreciation of the fact that at the bar, there has been a massive push on the women's agenda, which has been great, fantastic, although to me, it has been the white woman's agenda. For me, when we've had the women in law, 200 years, 100 years, it was not celebrating 100 years of Black women in law. But anyway, that essentially means that some chambers are a little bit behind. They're still talking about women and the fact that they need to be treated equally to men. And sometimes you may find yourself in these sorts of conversations feeling like you're in the 1950s. I've had those moments before. So it's difficult to then broach the subject of race when they haven't even really got the subject of gender right at all. Which is why I think when you come at it, you really need to think of a way in which you can do it, which is clear, which is uncompromising, because a lot of the times when it comes to us and we're trying to bring up issues of race, we almost have to be apologetic, or we have to tone things down so that people can either hear us or feel justified in the view that they have. And also definitely getting people in chambers who will support you. Any evidence or statistics that you can have as well helps. Fortunately or unfortunately, we are an evidence-based profession. Fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of race issues at the bar, there is no evidence to them. But if you can find any, then that would be particularly helpful. I think those would be my tips.
And Leslie or Joe, do either of you want to add to that?
Can I just add a couple of words, if I may? I think perhaps, and I agree entirely with what Natasha said, I think one of the reasons for that question is that the person asking it, either for themselves or for others, is expressing the anxiety that many junior members will feel about raising any issues which relate to their position within chambers. So we've had this, and one of the things I do with Lincoln's Inn is teach ethics and teach about how our code of conduct ought to operate and how the BSB oversees us, and that we have this problem, and it's a recurrent problem, that where you have junior members who feel that they're being treated badly, it may be a form of harassment, it may be a form of discrimination. It's so hard to speak up because the way in which our chamber system is set up is it's there essentially to try and minimize any fuss made about problems, because chambers are always worried about their corporate reputation. and about the individual reputations of those who may be causing the problem. This is exactly why one has to go back to our regulator for some form of guidance. Within the BSB regulations, there is a requirement in chambers to have a senior EDO. So that's a senior equality and diversity officer. And that person holds a number of different roles, but one of them ought surely to be, because they are senior, that somebody who has a problem which they're finding it difficult to bring to the attention of the head of chambers or anyone else, should be able safely to go to their senior EDO and raise that problem with them, so that the senior EDO takes on responsibility, helps them by giving them allyship, and even perhaps becomes the spokesperson for that problem, so that we create some distance from the person who's actually on the receiving end. And this would give, I think, a lot of young barristers a sense of reassurance that if I have a problem, I don't need to keep it to myself. There is a person to whom I can go and tell.
Neil, have you identified questions from the huge list we have?
I have tried. Let me, in essence, have two questions. Firstly, the panel's talked about sort of setting up BAME networks and groups and organisations, but is this to raise awareness of racism, or is there a danger that it could create a them and us culture? Leslie, what do you think?
That danger does exist, but it comes back to what I was saying earlier on. You know, if you want, the bar is meant to be full of reasonable people. You know, that's who we are meant to be as barristers and lawyers, reasonable people. Well, if we present reasonable people with information which shows there is a problem, you would hope that reasonable people would sit up and listen and think we need to solve this problem, as opposed to becoming defensive and thinking it's us and them. There's no us and them. We are all barristers. The only difference is I walk around in black skin and you might walk around in white skin. And so that's the point to be made.
Yeah, do you agree with that, Joe and Natasha?
If I may, just on this one, one has to see this historically. Why do we have these organizations? Why do they come into existence? Why is there a need for them? What sort of gap are they filling? My own view is that we're still on a journey. I would love to be at a point in history where we could say we don't need these organizations anymore because they serve their purpose, and that white people who are genuine about pushing a progressive agenda have now made the space and accommodated these underlying concerns, and that we have a level playing field which is genuinely level and not just purports to be level. What a wonderful world that would be. We're not there yet. There is a reason why these organizations exist. And I'll give you a simple example, Neil. I was president of the Society of Asian Lawyers for about 3 years, which is a very large organization which was brought into existence a quarter of a century ago because Asian lawyers felt that they needed to be able to coalesce with each other so that they could share the concerns and problems that they had been experiencing. So it was a form of mutual support, almost like a safe space. But that organization, as it has evolved, has begun to include people who are black and people who are white as well, so that almost its identity, its DNA, has begun to become dissolved. And in a sense, that's where you want to be, where effectively the organization is so successful that its very raison d'etre becomes unnecessary or otiose. But we're not there. And I think that we need to recognize if women need their own groups, if other minorities need their own groups, and black people need their own groups, and Asian people need their own groups, there is a genuine reason for that, and we should embrace it. And eventually one day, all of us will realize we're not in any particular group anymore, because we're all at the point where we need to be.
Yeah, I mean, Natasha, you were saying about the Women's Forum and how it mainly was white women. And so I suppose trying to target Black, Asian and minority ethnic people seem to be more beneficial in order to address their concerns rather than such a wide forum?
Not necessarily. As I am Black and I am also a woman, I have to deal with the issues of intersectionality. If you've heard of Kimberly Crenshaw, that's great. If you haven't, then maybe go look at Kimberly Crenshaw. But essentially, from what I understood from what she said, is that when you're dealing with issues, identity issues, it tends to be the more dominant part of that group and their agenda that gets pushed. So when you're talking about the women's agenda, it is the white women's agenda. When you're talking about the anti-racist agenda, you're talking about Black men. So there isn't really much being said about Black women. So do I think that there should be groups for BAME generally and then groups for women generally? Not necessarily. I do think that there is a need for conversations to properly be had within organisations such as those, so that all issues are addressed. The reason why I set up the Black Barristers Network was quite simply because I thought Black barristers have a different experience at the bar to everybody else. The same way Asian barristers have a completely different experience at the bar to everybody else. And I wanted us to be in a position where we could share our common experience, our common understanding, support and uplift ourselves and each other, and have our voices heard. That's why I set it up. I think it's a very good idea. It was also because Black people at the bar, apart from maybe in my current chamber, but in other places, are literally just, we're dotted about everywhere. And because we've gone past that time that I think Leslie Thomas mentioned earlier on, where you would have chambers which would be formed of ethnic minority barristers and will mainly have that, and now we have a situation where we're all intermingling. You will find a lot of Black barristers who will be the only Black barrister in chambers, sometimes even the only ethnic minority in chambers, and that can be an extremely isolating experience. So the part of the reason why I set up the Black Barristers Network was so that we could have that experience together. We can talk about these issues. So when I have a difficult opponent in court, I don't think that I've gone mad, or maybe I said something wrong, or maybe I did something wrong, maybe it was something to do with them. So yeah, I think there is a place for them, and I completely agree with Joe that ideally we will get to a place where their place is not needed in terms of trying to change things at the bar. But there are certainly other aspects where I think we could be of use generally. I like the fact that we get to share our culture. There are certain things that we like as Black people generally would like, particularly like to watch, do, think, speak, everything. And it's just nice to be amongst people who can share that, as opposed to having to be at the bar full of white people and having to, I don't know, talk about Tchaikovsky or something that's not necessarily interesting to me. I know those were really bad examples, but I hope you get the idea of what I'm saying. It's just nice to be able to have a similar cultural understanding. Our deference to elders, calling our family friends, auntie and uncle, even though they are not part of our family at all, and things like that, just things that we can all just share.
Yeah. I mean, the questions are still there, and we won't get through them all, and we'll no doubt try and find a way in which we can answer them, particularly on recruitment and sort of addressing policies to do with racism. But before I hand over to Brie for the final, let me just, since we're having this cathartic discussion, I'm interested from the panel, what inappropriate question have you been asked? And let me just give you an example, and this happened to me very recently, pre-lockdown, when we could travel. I was at after court at Victoria Tube Station when a woman came up to me and said, do you speak English? And I have to say, there was that 5-second pause where I was like, wow. And then I thought, actually, if I didn't speak and understand English, what would I actually think of that question? But anyway, I said, yes, I do. To which she said, oh, thank goodness. And deep down, I thought, wow, what has happened to you? And this is quite an elderly woman. What has happened to you that you associate anyone not white, not English? That's the default position that you've adopted. And then she then asked, you know, does this train go to a particular station? And I read a sort of a scrolling screen, and it didn't. And tongue in cheek, I said to her, you're very lucky, madam, And she goes, why is that? I said, not only can I understand and speak English, but I'm able to read it as well. And then I got on the train. But I'm interested what the panel think of an inappropriate question that they've been asked. Leslie.
So that reminds me when I was on holiday on a beach in my shorts, probably had a cocktail in a hand, and I was at a bar. And you know, as you do when you're on holiday and you're in a bar somewhere, and you meet, you know, somebody else who's on holiday, and the question normally comes around to, so what do you do in life? And so I said what I did, and the response was, you don't look like a barrister. And so I said, well, what does that mean? He goes, well, you're not dressed like one.
As if there's some
I think
sort of...
you should take it as a compliment, Leslie.
Yeah, Joe, what about you? Any inappropriate question that you've been asked?
You know, I genuinely cannot think of an inappropriate question that I've been. I think I might have one of those faces where people think twice before they ask me an inappropriate question. They probably think he's going to bite my head off if I ask him that. I don't know. I mean, the usual one, Neil. I think we'll all have had this one. You know, so tell me where do you come from? And I think that's such a common question. It's actually lost its just lost its value because it's such a. It's a bit like when you're a criminal barrister and they say, how do you represent people you know are guilty? It's one of those sorts of questions. I think, you know, we are still at a stage, sadly, in our nation's evolution where people have not got their head around the fact that some people have actually been born here. And even if they weren't born here, they may identify with being from here because they've been here so long, they don't know anything else than being a Black British person or an Asian British person. So I think probably that sort of, but it's lost its impact on me now when people ask that question. I keep thinking of more and more creative and inventive ways of answering it to have a laugh at their expense. But you know, perhaps in 5 years, 10 years, we won't be getting those sort of questions anymore. Somehow, I doubt it.
Yeah. Natasha, how about you? Any inappropriate question?
I mean, I think on a bar related one, I've had a similar one to Leslie Thomas at a party, but with my response of being a barrister, the person didn't believe it so much that I had to bring up my Chambers profile on my phone and show it to them so that they could believe it.
Wow. I'm going to see if this makes you all nod, because suggested in chat was a familiar phrase, you speak so well. Yeah, I thought that might resonate. Well, just to wind up, I think, Neil, we had a couple of points, didn't we? If we could ask our panelists just very quickly, if you could require the Inns of Court to do one thing, what would it be? Leslie?
I think I would say to the Inns, you really need to look at the actual recruitment and the levels, because there's a real problem, and I see this in all the Inns. I give talks often to the Inns, and you see at the student stage so many Black and brown faces, you know, very diverse student events. And then you get to the, you know, new practitioners where they've been in 1 or 2 years of practice, and the colour diversity completely changes. It's no longer diverse in such a short period of time. And so that's telling me that despite the fact that there are people of colour who are interested in the bar and who are turning up at these events, why is it that when you get to the early stages of practice and the new practitioners 1, 2, 3 years call, where have all the brown people have gone? Where have they gone? Why haven't they been recruited? And I think the Inns, because the Inns are made up with chambers, they need to be asking that question honestly of themselves, because something is going wrong.
Thank you. Natasha.
I would agree with Leslie. I think that recruitment really does need to be looked at. I think we do need to make sure that our scholarships and the way we hand out scholarships is really fair. I have recently been on a training for scholarship interviews, and the unconscious bias part was quite interesting, because when anybody said, oh, what could you be unconsciously biased towards the candidates? Responses we got were maybe the way they're dressed, or like their nail color, or like I was like, maybe the color of their skin. And everyone was just like, oh, so maybe we need to start thinking about that. I think there's also other things we can do. Looking at your benches, how many ethnic minorities do you have? You need to consider that. And then also, I absolutely adore, particularly Lincoln's Hall is stunning. It is beautiful. It's full of wonderful, magnificent paintings. But could you please commission some ethnic minority paintings in there as well? Think about maybe Dame Linda or somebody, because just constantly sitting in a room full of white men with images of white men on the walls can get a bit tiring.
I'm always struck by, which comes back to really the point Leslie were making, you've made, the contrast between the live human beings in the room on cool night and what is on the wall. Joe, the one thing you would call on the inns to do.
I will pick up on a suggestion made by Natasha, which I think is really important. When I became a bencher of Lincoln's Inn.
Your voice has dropped, Joe. Can you give us some volume?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, great.
When I became a bencher at Lincoln's Inn in 2014, one of the things that struck me was the fact that in the room where I had my first benchers meeting, I was probably the only non-white person there and the only person below the age of 50. I think the governing body of each Inns of Court sets the tone, sets the standard, and signals to everybody else in which direction that inn wants to travel. The composition of their benchership is extremely important. We need desperately better diversity amongst our benchers. If we do that, because they are the people who run the inn, we are more likely to hear sympathetic people to all the changes we want to bring in. We at Lincoln's Inn, who have hosted this event this evening, have taken a big step forward in progressing these debates, and I'm very proud of Lincoln's Inn for having undertaken that responsibility. But it is just a first step. Let's see those faces change in the corridors of power. Remember, of course, that the benchers are often people who hold very senior positions in the judiciary. They are people right up to the top in the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal, and of course, many High Court judges and Crown Court judges. If they are a diverse bunch of people, it's more likely that that diversity ethos will cascade downwards so that other people will begin to feel that places like Lincoln's Inn, Gray's Inn, Middle Temple, Inner Temple are taking these issues so seriously at the very top.
Thank you very much. Neil, was there anything you wanted to say wrapping up?
Well, as I say, I endorse entirely what the panel said. Recruitment and presence not only just at the benchers table, but presence in the form of paintings. When people sit in that hall and they look on the walls and they look at the bench table, it needs to be representative of the world that we're living in. And then that's not in any way putting down what's happened in the past and putting down the history of the inn, which we should be incredibly proud of. But it's just realizing that things have changed. The world has become more global, more international, and that needs to be reflected. But Brie, I'm interested, as a white member of the bar, what are your thoughts of everything that's happened?
I'm very conscious that actually when we're talking about racism, for me, it's a white problem. It's a white issue. and very conscious of the need to listen, to learn, but to then look at all the spheres of influence I have with my white privilege and the privilege of seniority that I have, and see what practical things I can do to move things forward. You know, the reality is we can all sort of sit back and think this is way too big a challenge. I can't change it. But actually, small changes, small shifts, using your, as I say, sphere of influence to find a way to amplify voices, to ensure people who are not getting sponsorship, mentoring, are getting that, to call out what's going on. You know, for me, I had someone talking very powerfully, I won't say where, but about, and using the phrase, I have your back, whether that's, you know, in the playground, in the street, in the workplace. Let's say that in our profession, in our inns, in our chambers, I have your back. I think that's my responsibility.
Yeah, Joe, I think Brie's outlined the sort of part that white allies have to play in doing this sort of change. What does it look like for you?
I think we're going to have to do this collectively, Neil, and Brie is absolutely right. It's so good, actually, to hear somebody of a white background in the way that Brie has expressed herself, showing that self-awareness that the problem is being caused by one group of people largely to another group of people who are less powerful in society, that there is an inherent injustice in that, and that we therefore have an individual but collective responsibility to deal with it rather than to just walk on by. And I feel very actually encouraged by the discussion that we've had tonight, because although, you know, the questions have been streaming in and we've been, as the panel, answering what you've asked us, I want to believe that all the people who are listening and watching, particularly white people who are trying to improve their understanding of this problem, come away with it with a sense of enthusiasm. They feel more emboldened that when they come across instances of what they know is wrong behavior, that they are willing to stand up and not be silent over it. So if little panel events like this act as catalysts for change, I think we've done an enormously good thing tonight.
Natasha, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I agree entirely with everything that's been said. I think, you know, in order to have true allies, I think you need to, as I've said before, work on yourself, look at your own biases, check your privilege, and then start listening to people, looking at the world through these fresh eyes of being able to see race, being able to see where certain people are being favoured over others, and start to challenge that. But then also speak to the people about it. Because sometimes you'll have white saviours who will come along and be like, I've seen this and it's really horrible and I'm going to sort it, without actually really like engaging or speaking to the people that are affected and giving them the tools to help themselves if they need them. So I think there needs to be an open dialogue between everybody to make sure that everybody is empowered, including people like myself, to be empowered to deal with things myself if that's something that I want to do.
But Leslie, it's time to empower the white allies as well to make this catalyst of change.
I agree. Yes, I think, you know, to move forward, we all play a part.
I mean, I have to say, this sort of conversation has been absolutely fantastic. I mean, from all of you, I get the sense that whilst there was a little bit of frustration, because this is something that has been talked about for a number of years, and you've all highlighted that this is a problem, but it's taken someone tragically across the pond to suffer for 8 minutes and 49 seconds. But there's the gratification that we are now talking about it and talking properly and genuinely about it. And hopefully, I think you all hope for some lasting change as a result. Is that fair to say? Yeah. Good.
Yeah, I think my main concern is that this is all being a bit performative. So I really want to make sure that we actually do the work to make sure that we can make change at the bar.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Do you agree with that, Joe? Let's make real change this time.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of this evening wasn't that we would just be a talking shop, but that we would provoke people, provoke them into changing their thinking, or to help them to think differently by giving them different voices. We're three people. We've got Natasha, we've got Leslie, and we've got me on this panel. And each of us brings our own life histories to this discussion. And we're not going to necessarily agree about everything, but there are certain ground rules about which all of us ought to be agreeing when we talk about fairness and justice and equality. And I think if everyone subscribes to those ground rules, whatever differences there might be between us, we have a platform for change. And Natasha's absolutely right. Let this not just be a talking point. Let this be the beginning of something. We want to achieve change. And one of the ways, of course, you've got to achieve change is to change mindsets and open people's minds. And this certainly, I think, has been achieved in the course of tonight.
Mm. I mean, Leslie, you spoke at the start about the difficulties, but you hope really that this is the start of lasting change.
Yes, I hope so. I hope that this is just not a small moment in time, and come, the next news cycle event, we are talking about something else. I hope this is a real point in time where we make a difference.
Thank you.
I think we'll wrap up on that point. Thank you all. You've been an incredible panel, absolutely amazing. Thank you for your honesty, your passion, the challenges you've sent out to us. The forum, which Joe and Neil and I are all involved in, is planning to do the third in this series of events, 4 events over this year in July. We're hoping that with COVID and it all being online, we can pull it together. We have a lot of material to think about that we've seen in the conversations on chat, that we've got in questions that we haven't been able to get to. So we will try and make it an exercise in taking tonight on to a next step to do the lasting work that needs to happen. So thank you to everyone, and thank you to all of the audience who signed in, and so many of you who've stayed on so way over our time slot. We really appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Good evening.
Thank you all, guys.